Okay, hello everyone and welcome again. This is webinar number 18 in a series of webinars that I've been producing during the lockdown period here in New Zealand. We're now into level 3 and we have some promising signs here in New Zealand regarding our fight against the virus. So I hope wherever you are watching that you're safe and things are starting to improve for you. So if this is the first webinar that you've watched, perhaps you can see my name there on the bottom left. I'm Greg. I've been an English teacher for about the last 15 or so years. Most of that time I was over in Korea teaching at a university there, and I've been back here in New Zealand, my homeland, for the last couple of years. So most of those 2 years I've spent helping students with the IELTS test. So what we have done over the last 18 webinars is we started off with 8 webinars looking at writing task 2. Then we looked at some grammar, then then reading using the GRAID website. And for the last 3 webinars, we've been looking at a practice listening test on the GRAID website. So this will be the final section from that practice test. The listening tests always have 4 sections. And then the next free webinar will be next Tuesday. This Thursday, there'll be a webinar for GRAID subscribers. And during that webinar, we're going to look at writing task 2. On Sunday, this Sunday coming up, there will be a replay. So for the next Sundays, or for the following Sundays, there will be replays of the 18 webinars that I just mentioned. So if you missed any of those webinars, you can watch them, the replays on Sunday, and there'll be someone there to field any questions that you might have about them. So at this point, I'd like to take you over to the GRAID website and let's get on with listening section 4. So okay, so at this point, you should be able to see the GRAID landing page, the dashboard. So you can see here on the site, you can practice your writing, reading. There's a speaking module. Today, as I mentioned, we're going to look at the last section of the listening test. So that is listening test here. So if you remember previously, we had a booking in scenario for a hotel for section 1. Then we heard one about skydiving. Last time we did section 3, which is another dialogue. That was a series of complaints. Well, it actually was a role play about complaints. Today is listening section 4. This is one of the heavier sections. Listening section 4 is basically almost always, well, I haven't found many examples where they're not, but listening section 4 is usually an academic or educational setting. So the reason I say it's heavy is because usually the topics are quite specific. I will tell you with today's listening test, listening section, there's not as much grammar transformation where you have to change the words from the listening track. There were plenty of examples of those in the last listening section 3. Today there are not many examples, or I can't think of any examples where you have to change the words. But the topic is really specific, so that's what makes it difficult for some. So let's get on with it. So again, 40-minute test, give or take, and you have that time at the end of the test where you can transfer your answers from your question paper to the answer paper. That's the 10 minutes at the end. If you're going to follow at home, you can scribble down any notes, and just remember in that test, the actual test, you have that time. So we're going to go to section 4. So I'm going to play you'll hear the narrator at the start here. Hopefully this is nice and loud. I've got my volume as loud as it can go. Hopefully you'll hear the narrator give you a preview of what is to come.
Section 4. You will hear a lecture about bridges. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 33.
Okay, so here we're told that we're going to listen to a lecture. So there's that idea of an educational setting. And the lecture is about bridges. So the first thing I'd be doing is I'd read the questions. And as I read questions 31 to 33, I would just be thinking of any kinds of words or phrases that I know about bridges. As I said, it's very topic specific, and there may be some words today on the question paper that you're not aware of. This is practice, so I'm going to just mention any words that I think you might want to know. So Mesopotamians, they are an ancient people from the Middle East. So if you went back in time 5,000 or so years into modern day Iraq, you would arrive in Mesopotamia. So some of the first people from the West or Middle East. So what material the ancient Mesopotamians not use to build bridges? And again, there's one of those interesting questions where we're looking at two things we are likely to hear. Well, maybe not the exact words, but hopefully we'll hear the exact words. So two of those words we hope to hear, and one of them we will not, right? So that's quite a common question where you have to, the answer is what you don't hear, right? So question 32, just keep making these predictions all the time. Which threat to the ancient Mesopotamian bridges does the lecturer mention, right? So here's the opposite, where you're only listening for what you do hear, right? So rival clans, the weather, damage from travelers. Now, obviously in the test, you don't have a lot of time to make these predictions. Sometimes it's easier to make predictions. In this case, I can't say I know a lot about ancient Mesopotamian bridges, so this would even be difficult for me. So, but what I can do is I can just look at these keywords, and the other one I would be, the keyword to me here is threat, right? So threat, danger, risk. That's what I mean by a prediction. So you just try to narrow in on what can help you in the question paper. Maybe we're going to hear the word threat, or as I mentioned, it could be risk or danger, some other synonyms. And then the final one that we're told for this little part of the listening track is question 33. What Roman advances in bridge building does the lecturer not mention? Okay, so here we're gonna hear two of these things, or maybe paraphrased. One of those we will not hear. But what we can also tell is this lecture must be, it's not just about Mesopotamians. We're also going to hear some information about Romans. I'm pretty sure that most of you will know who the Romans were. Advances means when something is improved, like an improvement in technology. In particular, bridge building. So let's listen, and as I've been doing with the previous listening tracks, I'm just going to stop and explain the answers for you. So if you do want to get your pen and paper ready at home, go for it. Again, I'm cheating. I have the script and I will repeat back parts of it. So you're going to notice this listening track is quite a bit longer than some of the previous ones. Not as much grammar transformation, but it really is a test of just listening for detail. So let's get started. So this little pause at the moment is the time that you would actually have.
As you listen to the first part of the talk, answer questions 31 to 33.
Okay, now it's showtime. So you always have sort of 20, 30 seconds. So not a lot of time in the actual test. Now we're going to start listening to the track.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's lecture. I would like to start with a simple question for you all. How did you get here today? By train, by bus, by car? Did you walk? Whatever your mode of transport, the chances are that most of you crossed a bridge to get here.
Okay, if you have not heard the word Mesopotamian or Mesopotamia, well done. This is just the introduction to the lecture. I also wanted to point out that some of you may recognize this as a British accent. So just to repeat, the main types of accents that you're likely to encounter in an IELTS test are usually British accents, American accents, Australian, which we have some examples of on the GRAID site. Sometimes you might hear a New Zealand accent, which is similar to mine. One thing I can add, though, is that the accents that you hear are usually the very standard varieties from all of those different regions. So you're very unlikely to hear regional accents, right? Regional means like the sort of lesser known accents from the different parts of the world. So hopefully we're going to hear something about ancient Mesopotamians very soon.
So today, my lecture is about bridges. The ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia were the first to construct bridges. With the transfer of technology, bridges started appearing in other parts of the world. However, these early bridges were very basic. They were constructed with the materials available, such as logs, stones, and soil.
Okay, hopefully you heard the lecturer mention the materials that the ancient Mesopotamians used, and I'm going to repeat back what he said. They were constructing with the materials available, such as logs, stones, and soil. So while he's using those exact words, and clearly he did not say vines, sorry, I'll go back up and make sure I've selected that. So to me, this is the difficulty. So the actual questions themselves are maybe not so difficult, but what is difficult is just the sheer content, or how much is spoken in this last section. And I know by the end of the listening test, a lot of students are tired on test day. So it's, it can be a battle, but you just have to listen really attentively and focus in. And hopefully, like today, hopefully the questions for you in section 4 are maybe straightforward. But I guess they're not always straightforward, because they tend to deal with more specific vocabulary about specific topics. So again, the key word here is threat. We may hear that word, or we may hear something related to threat, a synonym perhaps. Let's listen on.
The obvious drawback was that these early bridges could only traverse short spans. They were also vulnerable to the elements.
Okay, so I'm going to repeat that last sentence. The lecturer said, when talking about the bridges, they were also vulnerable, or vulnerable, there's two alternative pronunciations. They were also vulnerable to the elements. This is a tougher question, because if you're not sure, the elements means the weather, right? So here we have a paraphrased term. You may have narrowed down the answer being the weather, because he didn't mention anything about rival clans or travelers. But just to clarify, the elements is another way of saying the weather, right? So could be, extreme heat or heavy rainfall. That's usually what we mean by the elements. Okay, and the last one for this little part of the listening track is question 33, the last multiple choice. And again, if you look at the whole paper, that'll give you an idea of how the section is broken up. When you have a different question type, that usually means the break, right? So what advances, what new technology did the Romans bring to bridge building? But again, we have to find out what is not said, right? So that keyword here is not.
Two major advances in bridge building occurred in ancient Rome, where engineers started using mortar and arches.
Okay, that one was more straightforward. Hopefully at home, you heard the lecturer use the keyword advances. Then he talked about ancient Rome. And the two words that he did mention were arches and mortar. I'll repeat that whole sentence for you. Two major advances in the bridge building came in ancient Rome, where engineers started using mortar and arches, right? So he didn't use those exact phrases, but he did use the two keywords, arches and mortar. If you're not sure what mortar is, it means basically a way of making concrete. But you didn't really need to know that, because he did just say that word and it's written on the test paper. So that means our answer is the use of large blocks. So we'll listen up to the rest of this part here.
Romans discovered that mortar could be produced from pulverized volcanic rock. Employing arches meant that the downward force from the top of the bridge was met by an equal force from the bottom of the bridge foundation. The use of mortar and arches meant that Roman bridges were much bigger, stronger, and more durable. Roman engineers spread the use of mortar and arches in the 900 bridges that they built throughout the Roman Empire.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 34 to 40.
Okay, so as I said, I think just about every section that I've come across, there's a little pause in the section, and that's reflected in the different question types on the paper. So now we're going to move on to question 34. And like a lot of the other ones we've looked at, it's a fill in the blanks, right? So very common question type, whether it be on the reading test or the listening test. Again, and we saw many examples of this last time for section 3, sometimes you have to transform the words that you hear to be grammatically accurate to fill in the blanks on the paper. I'm going to tell you this time around you're not going to be asked to do that as much. But again, the challenge is going to be understanding this very specific topic. Unless you're an engineer, I guess most of you at home aren't really going to know a lot about bridge building. So again, that is often the difficulty with the last listening section. It's often a topic which you're not familiar with. But we can make predictions. We can think about what we're going to hear. So next, we're going to hear about Indian engineers. Now, to me, iron chain cables, right? That seems like something that is likely to be said. Without being an engineer myself, I can't really think of many other ways of saying iron chain cables. Another hint that we can take here is the preposition in and AD, right? So that means after the life of Jesus, essentially. So that means we're going to be looking for a time, right? So it's most likely going to be a year, or it could be a century, right? So those are the two ways that we can talk about time. It could be a specific year or a century, right? So right now it's the 21st century AD. But I guess this is going to be an earlier time. So I don't think I'm going to attempt to pronounce that name because I might not pronounce it correctly. I'll have a go. Thangtong Gyalpo. Okay, sorry if I offended anyone with my poor pronunciations, but I would say the key word here is going to be yak, right? I can't think of any other way of saying yak, which is an animal. So I want to listen out for that word yak, and it's something else he used alongside yaks, right? So he was a bridge builder and he built bridges using yak skins and something else. If you wanted to go into more depth, you could even start guessing what materials. Maybe it was wood. Who knows? That's what we're going to find out. Question 36. Bridge decks can now be suspended with a system of, right? So obviously we're going to hear, we've seen the word now, we're going to hear more about modern bridges, right? So they can be suspended with a system of. Now, this is something I can probably more easily predict because I live in present time. So I'm thinking maybe cables or something like that, right? When I think of a suspension bridge, I think of those big giant cables. That's my actual prediction for the answer. 37, bridge builders of the late 18th and early 19th centuries had to deal with storms, snow, and, well, maybe you're on the same, you have the same idea as me. Maybe it's going to be some other element, right? So that's what we mean by elements. Some other weather pattern, right? Storms, snow, maybe ice. That seems like a logical prediction, but we know it's likely, well, it's going to be a noun, right? 38. The addition of the web truss dramatically. Now, again, I'd be using the grammar cue here. So dramatically is an adverb. So it must be followed by an adverb, an adjective rather. So adverb, adjective, just like very good, right? So very is an adverb, good is an adjective. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I'm pretty sure that it is an adjective. So you can either use the vocabulary or the grammar to help you guide your predictions. Then we have one about the longest suspension bridge in the world. It opened. Now, you need to think, how could this sentence be closed? It could be closed using a time phrase, or it could also be a place, right? So I'm going to be listening out for the longest suspension bridge because I don't think there are many other ways of saying that. But then when I hear something about the opening, maybe we're going to hear about a place where it opened, or the place where it opened, or when it opened. The last one here, the world's longest bridge of is the Danyang Kunshan Grand Bridge. Now, of. So again, another preposition. So we're expecting to see a noun here, right? So very difficult to make a lot of predictions for section 4 in general, but what you can do is at least read through those questions as quickly as you can and just try and get an idea about the kind of words that you're going to hear. Maybe on your paper, underline the keyword that you're going to listen out for. Yeah, it's a heavy section. So you're not going to be confronted with as many grammar transformation type questions today. Let's see how well you can listen attentively and how much of this you can pick up. Again, I'm going to stop it when we get to the answer and explain.
Now listen and answer questions 34 to 40.
The next breakthrough in bridge construction was the introduction of suspension bridges. The first suspension bridge mounted the roadway directly on cables that were made from vines. Later, in the 4th century AD, Indian engineers started using iron chain cables.
Okay, this is something which happens quite often. We have the information on the paper presented in the different order than what we hear in the listening, right? So what I mean by that is I'm going to write down the answer for you, and the answer is I think there are two ways of saying this. You could say 4th century. So here we could list 4th century or the 4th century. This is where I think there are many alternative answers. I think would be the best, but you might want to write it out, or you could use the numeral and th, right? So both of those I'm absolutely sure would be acceptable on test day. But what happened here is we have the answer before the keywords that we see on the paper. So what he said was later, in the 4th century AD, so there's our answer, Indian engineers started using iron chain cables, right? So hopefully that makes sense to you now. The actual answer to fill in the blank was before those keywords that are listed on the paper. So you have to be aware that the information that you hear is not always presented in the same way or spoken in the same way that it's written on the question paper. It's by no means easy, this test. I'm sure you know that too. Let's listen, and hopefully we're going to hear this guy's name. Might hear something about yaks. I imagine we will.
Other famous suspension bridges were built by a Tibetan saint named Thangtong Gyalpo in the 15th century. He built 58 suspension bridges from iron ropes and yak skins in Tibet and Bhutan.
Okay, so this is a tricky one because there are actually two words to fill in this blank. I would present the two words with a comma, just like you were writing an actual sentence. You may be, what am I doing? The answer is not comma. So iron, comma, ropes. You may be lucky if you leave out the comma, that may be acceptable. I can't confirm that, but I think if you wanted to have the best answer, then I would put in the comma as you would in an actual sentence, right? So noun, comma, and noun. Noun, comma, noun, and noun, right? So imagine those two words were actually on the gap. So moving on to 36. Now, again, I think when I see the word now, hopefully we're going to hear something about modern times.
The last of these stood until 2004. Suspension bridges that didn't use towers were built in the early 19th century. The suspension bridges of today.
Okay, so here's a use of a synonym. So on the answer paper, on the question paper rather, we see the term now. In the listening, the lecturer uses the term today. So just to repeat what he began with, the suspension bridges of today
are built using a system of cables and towers to suspend the bridge deck.
Again, the information on the question paper is spoken in a different order, right? But hopefully you heard that the answers were cables and towers, right? So here we have bridge decks can now be suspended with a system of cables and towers. That information was presented by the lecturer in this way. When he spoke, he said, the suspension bridges of today are built using a system of cables and towers to suspend the bridge deck. So just something to make some questions more difficult. You will come across this where that information is in a different order from the question paper. Okay, maybe some elements here. Maybe not, but that's just what I think is a logical answer, because storms, snow, they're elements, part of weather patterns, that it might not necessarily be the answer. Let's listen. But I think the keywords here I'm going to listen for are the 18th and 19th centuries. No other ways of saying those. Maybe 1800s, 1900s. Sorry, it would be 1700s and 1800s would be the other way of saying 18th and 19th centuries.
Engineers of the late 18th and 19th centuries.
Luckily, he just used those exact same terms. So we just heard him say 18th and 19th centuries. So your ears should be pricking up. Hopefully the answer is going to come very shortly.
Refined the techniques used to construct suspension bridges. Bridge builders of this era had to deal with storms, snow, and increasingly heavy loads. One of the most famous...
Okay, so quite a difficult part here, because we hear the first reference to the 18th and 19th century in the first sentence, and then what he did is he referenced that time in the second sentence. So I'm going to repeat that whole part for you. Engineers of the late 18th and early 19th centuries refined the techniques used to construct suspension bridges. Then he starts a new sentence. Bridge builders of this era, right? So era means a time. So the era he's talking about is the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Bridge builders of this era had to deal with, right? So here were some problems that they had. They had to deal with storms, snow, and here is the answer, increasingly heavy loads. Now, this is what I mean by some very topic-specific vocabulary. If you're not sure what it means by heavy load, this means the people that cross the bridges, right? The weight of whatever they were carrying, whether it be, I guess in those times, probably, being drawn by a horse, right? So maybe they had a carriage with some products in the carriage. That carriage with the products, that is the load, right? So it means the weight, right? So those weights that were being carried across the bridges, they were getting heavier and heavier. So we've got 3 more to go. Now, I think truss, a web truss, right? So obviously something to do with bridges, but hopefully we're going to hear that as a keyword.
As engineers of this time was German-born American John Augustus Roebling, who built bridges across the Niagara Gorge and the Ohio River. But he is best known for work on the iconic Brooklyn Bridge, which connects Brooklyn and Manhattan across the East River in New York. Roebling pioneered a web truss.
Okay, so a lot of information in these section 4 lecture type sections, aren't there? So we heard him introduce a new bridge builder or a new engineer, and we just heard that key term, web truss. So again, there is kind of a balance. While the section's quite long and the vocabulary and topics are very specific, often the words that we see on the paper are spoken in the listening track. So he began the sentence by saying, Roebling pioneered a web truss. All right, so hopefully we're going to get the answer soon.
Which he added to the side of a bridge roadway. This technique greatly increased the strength of his bridges.
Okay, so we hear a paraphrase term or a synonym. Dramatically, he used the term greatly, right? So I'm going to repeat what he said. So this technique, so the web truss technique, this technique greatly, and here's the answer, increased the strength, right? So we're just dictating what is said here, right? So there's no need to change that. The grammar is correct. The addition of the web truss dramatically increased the strength of bridges. So again, another challenge is you'll often hear 2 sentences, and those two sentences are often summarized on the question paper. So again, just a lot more content to listen to in section 4, but hopefully you're following at home. Okay, the longest suspension bridge in the world. So hopefully we're going to hear that term. And again, it could be a time or it could be a place. If you're a bridge expert, you might already know this answer. So sometimes you might be lucky and you might get a topic in section 4 or on any of the reading sections. It might be a topic that you're familiar with. If that is the case, that's just luck, I think.
Other important developments during this period were the use of cable spinning by the French engineer Louis Vicard and the introduction of the pneumatic caisson, which is an enclosed watertight structure that is used during bridge construction in water or wet areas. In most recent times, modern steel alloys have allowed engineers to construct much longer bridges. The Akashi Kaikyo Bridge, the world's longest suspension bridge, opened in 1998.
Okay, so luckily we did hear that same term, but again, we have to process a lot of information till we get to the next answer. There's, a lot of content, but he changes his intonation to move to a different topic. And he said the Akashi Kaikyo Bridge, the world's longest suspension bridge, opened, and here is our answer, in, 1998, right? So it was a time phrase, right? I guess you could argue that if you knew where that bridge is, you could suggest that the answer is in Japan. I would go with the obvious answer, right? So I think absolutely the best answer here, the safest answer definitely would be in 1998. So it's a listening test, it's not a general knowledge test. So if you hear in 1998, then that would be the best answer to give. Okay, we're on to the last one. Hopefully we're going to hear the name of this bridge, the Danyang Kunshan Grand Bridge.
It is 1,991 meters long and has 2 towers to connect the major Japanese islands, Honshu Island to Awaji Island. The bridge's roadway is 65 meters above the sea so most ships can pass under the bridge. The longest bridge of any kind is the 164-kilometer long Danyang Kunshan Grand Bridge, which opened in China in 2010.
Okay, this is a tricky one. So I'm going to repeat what he said. Again, this is where the information is presented in a different order on the question paper to how the speaker gives the information. What the lecturer said here was, the longest bridge of any kind is the 164-kilometer long Danyang Kunshan Grand Bridge, which opened in China in 2010. A very long sentence. And again, we did hear a noun, but before the noun, we have any, and then we have the noun kind, right? So that prediction about a noun being after the preposition of is correct, but a quite tricky one. So the world's longest bridge of any kind, right? So whether it be a suspension bridge or any other kind of bridge, is the Danyang Kunshan Grand Bridge. So I'm not actually going to play out the rest of this topic. I'm sorry if you're a fan of bridges, but yeah, there's not too much more to play, and I just wanted to go through the answers for this one here. So hopefully I haven't made any mistakes. If I have, then we'll soon find out. And I have. Oh my goodness, what have I done? It's probably spelling. So 35. Ooh, I think that should actually be acceptable, right? So I will have a word about that. So we'll review that. Yep, so I think actually, if iron was one acceptable answer, I think in this case, then iron ropes and yak skins would also be acceptable. So I'm not going to say I was wrong there, because as I mentioned on the IELTS paper, sometimes you have questions where there are more than one acceptable answer. And I'm sure in this case that iron, ropes is also acceptable, because that's what we heard in the audio file. So just want to recap and look ahead. So I'm going to take you back to the digital whiteboard. Okay, we'll see what I had earlier here. Okay, so I'm going to obviously get rid of that and just let you know again what's coming up. So Tuesdays, free webinar. So Tuesdays is I should put Tuesdays. So they're going to continue on Tuesdays. It's a free webinar. So just like today's one and the previous 17, anyone can join. You can watch on Facebook, the GRAID Facebook page. You feel free to ask questions. Haven't seen as many questions coming through about the listening, and that's to be expected, I guess, because it is hard to listen and type questions all at the same time. But I can tell you that next Tuesday we're going to go back to a writing webinar, right? So maybe you'll have some more questions about the writing, and I do welcome them. So whereas on Thursdays we have, this is a GRAID subscribers webinar. I'll make this a little bigger. Oops. I'll learn how to spell as well, so I'll get this onto one line to make it easier to read. So Thursdays we have the GRAID subscribers webinar. Yes, that's spelled right, subscribers. And on Sundays is the replays, right? So this is the end of the 18th webinar that has been produced during the the pandemic here, the COVID-19 pandemic. So on Sundays we're going to be replaying all of these webinars, and it's a chance where if you do want to watch the replay, there will be somebody at the other end who can answer questions live, right? So it's just another chance for you to interact with somebody. If the question can't be answered on the spot, then it can be followed up. So on Sundays, if you do watch a replay, you can connect with someone from the website. Again, those times are still going to be the same. Tuesdays, whether it be the free one on Tuesday or the subscribers webinar on Thursdays or the replay on Sundays, it'll be 1:30 Indian Standard Time, which here in New Zealand is 8 p.m. So I really hope you're staying safe wherever you are. And if I see you on Thursday, I look forward to that. Otherwise, I'll see you live next Tuesday. Take care.